大家好，我是塔哥，欢迎来到塔哥密谈录。今天我们要访谈哈佛大学天文系前主任、世界著名天体物理学家、奥陌陌天体外星飞船理论的创始人阿维·洛布教授。一说到奥陌陌，大家并不陌生，它是人类首次在太阳系内发现的星际天体，夏威夷土语的读法叫奥陌陌，意思就是第一位来自远方的使者。2017年10月19日，它被科学家首次发现，它的直径在100米级别，以每秒26公里左右的速度从天琴座方向冲进了太阳系，近乎与黄道面垂直，大约长400米，宽40米，颜色偏红，具有固态的表面，呈现出一个雪茄状。然而，有一位天文学家发现这个天外来客身上出现了反常的运行轨迹，以及难以解释的各种现象，并且发表了一篇论文，提出奥陌陌并不是自然天体，而是外星文明的智慧产物，它很有可能是一艘人工制造的飞行器。主流科学家认定外星人已来访，我们并不孤单。这个观点瞬间引起了全世界的激烈讨论。这位科学家就是塔哥本次要采访的阿维·洛布教授。阿维·洛布，世界著名天体物理学家，哈佛大学天文系前主任，哈佛大学黑洞计划的创始主任，哈佛·史密森天体物理中心理论与计算研究所所长，美国国家科学院物理学和天文学委员会前任主席。阿维·洛布撰写了6本书和约800篇科学论文，是美国艺术与科学院、国际宇航科学院的院士。2012年，阿维·洛布入选《时代》杂志评选的太空影响力25人。2016年，阿维·洛布教授和史蒂芬·霍金共同成立了突破摄星计划，他担任该计划的顾问委员会主席。该计划目的就是开发数千个纳米级别的星际飞船，去4.2光年以外的半人马座寻找外星文明。他的畅销书《外星人：如果外星人发来信号，我们要不要回应》于2021年10月在中国出版，以近乎实锤的证据来论证奥陌陌是外星文明的产物。同时，他也是伽利略计划的负责人。该计划旨在建立一个复杂的望远镜网络，用于扫描天空中的外星物体。本次访谈是塔哥奇谈频道有史以来邀请的最重磅的一位主流科学家。全网独家，阿维·洛布教授将揭示奥陌陌天体是外星飞船的惊人证据，以及他对 UFO 外星文明的探索的看法等等。请大家先3连后观看，养成好习惯。好了，话不多说，来吧，上干货。
Yes, thanks for having me, and it's a great pleasure.
Thank you. 好的，第一个问题，阿维教授，我们呢先开门见山。大家呢都知道，2017年的10月星际天体奥陌陌被科学家们发现，它的直径呢在100米级别，以每秒26公里左右的速度从天琴座方向冲进了太阳系，呈现出了雪茄形的形状。这是人类发现第一颗来自外太空的星际天体。您坚持认为奥陌陌不是天然陨石或者彗星，而是属于外星文明的人造物体。并且呢，您的理论也引起了学界的轩然大波。请问您可以详细的分享一下您是如何发现奥陌陌是外星人的飞船？这整个研究的过程是什么呢？并且有哪些证据可以支持到您的观点？谢谢。
Yes, so let me start by saying that I see science as an extension of our childhood curiosity. When we wonder about the world and ask questions and do not surrender to prejudice, to notions that we had in the past. That's the way a child learns about the world. And I see science as a privilege of maintaining that curiosity. I didn't have an agenda when this object showed up in 2017. It was the first object from interstellar space discovered near Earth. And it was unusual. At first, astronomers thought it's a comet, but there was no cometary tail, there was no gas or dust around it. The Spitzer Space Telescope put very tight limits on that. And then as the object was tumbling every 8 hours, the amount of sunlight reflected from it changed by a factor of 10. And that meant that it has a very extreme shape, just like a piece of paper tumbling in the wind, because in fact, the best fit to the variation of light was that of a flat object, pancake-like, not cigar-shaped. Projected on the sky, it looked elongated, but intrinsically, it was flat at the 90% confidence based on the fit to the variation of light that we modeled. And then the object was pushed away from the sun by a force whose nature was unclear because there was no evaporation of this object, no rocket effect. And I suggested that it must be the reflection of sunlight because this force declined smoothly inversely with distance squared from the sun. And that meant that the object must be very thin so that it would have a large area for its mass and sort of like a sail. And nature doesn't make thin objects. In fact, in September 2020, there was another object discovered by the same telescope in Hawaii that discovered Oumuamua. It was given the name 2020 SO. It was also pushed away from the sun by reflecting sunlight without a cometary tail. And it ended up being a rocket booster that we launched in 1966. Obviously, it was artificial because we produced it. The question is, who produced Oumuamua? And of course, if we had an image, we could tell because a picture is worth 1,000 words. And in my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book, Extraterrestrial. An attempt by scientists to explain the nature of Oumuamua as if it came from a natural origin. And all of these attempts concluded that it's something that we've never seen before, not a comet or an asteroid of the type that we have seen. So for example, there was a suggestion, maybe it's a cloud of dust particles that is 100 times less dense than air, so that when it comes close to the sun, it gets pushed by reflecting sunlight. And the problem is that it will get heated to hundreds of degrees and then will not maintain its integrity if it's a very fluffy cloud of dust. Then there was a suggestion, maybe it's a hydrogen iceberg, a chunk of frozen hydrogen, 100 meters in size, and the hydrogen evaporates just like in a comet, but we can't see it because it's transparent. And the problem with that is the hydrogen evaporates very easily by absorbing starlight, and it would not survive the journey. It can only survive a few million years, which is a very short time. It cannot propagate across more than 1% of the size of the Milky Way galaxy. And then there was a suggestion, maybe it's a nitrogen iceberg, a chunk of frozen nitrogen chipped off the surface of a planet like Pluto. And the problem there is the mass budget. If you go through the calculation, there is not enough nitrogen to explain Oumuamua as one member out of a population of chips of nitrogen. So all of these suggestions involved something we've never seen before. And that's why I'm saying we should definitely consider the possibility that it's artificial, which is something we've never seen before, because it's just like a caveman finding a cell phone. And the caveman is used to playing with rocks all of his life and would conclude that the cell phone is a rock of a type that we have never seen before, just like a hydrogen iceberg or a nitrogen iceberg for Oumuamua. It's a rock of a type that we've never seen before. But this is just the beginning of a learning experience, because if the caveman presses a button, he would realize that this unusual rock records his voice. And if he presses another button, it will record his image. And then it will become clear that it's not a rock, it's something else. And for us, it should be the same learning experience. The next object that looks as weird as Oumuamua should be looked at very carefully, and perhaps with a camera that flies near it on a spacecraft, so that we can tell its nature. And that would be very exciting if we can press a button and see what it does.
OK， 那么这个奥陌陌的天体，我之前看了很多的资料 好像是它在运行的过程中有出现了一些不寻常的一些移动速度的加速或者减速，我不太清楚这方面的细节是什么。还有一个就是，请问这个奥陌陌这个天体，它是否里面是有驾驶员在里面，或者说，它也只是一个无人控制的一个外星人所制造的一个飞船被遗弃的飞船而已。请问这个Loeb 教授，你是如何去理解，或者说您是如何认为的呢？
Right, so we don't have enough information about this object because astronomers thought that it's a rock and didn't collect all the information we could have collected. But one thing we know that is very strange about it is that it came from the so-called local standard of rest, which is the frame that you get to when you average the motions of all the stars in the vicinity of the sun. It's sort of like the galactic parking lot. And this object was at rest in that frame. Only 1 in 500 stars is so much at rest as this object was. So it clearly did not come from any of the nearby stars. And it was just like a buoy sitting at rest on the surface of the ocean, and the sun bumped into it and gave it a kick, like a giant ship. So that's about its trajectory, why it was really unusual. And moreover, there was this force acting on it that implied that it may be very thin, because it could have been just the reflection of sunlight that pushed it, just like the rocket booster from 1966 that I mentioned, 2020 SO. So these are the unusual facts about the motion of the object, but we don't know what its purpose is. We know that it was tumbling every 8 hours, and it could have been that it's just like a trash bag tumbling in the wind. It doesn't serve any purpose, that it's just trash. But it could also have been because it was trying to collect data. So it had a receiver that was moving around. We don't know what its purpose is. Now, if I want to imagine what kind of equipment we will meet from another advanced technological civilization, I would never assume that there is a living creature in it, because the travel between stars takes very long time, and the biological creatures cannot survive over that time. Space is very hazardous. There are cosmic rays that can destroy living cells, and it makes much more sense to send an artificial intelligence system that we are now developing to drive cars, that will make medical decisions in the future and will outsmart us. And it could be made of electronics that can survive for billions of years in principle, especially if you equip it with 3D printing, such that it can repair itself or even recreate itself. Just like biological systems, it can produce copies of itself when it uses the raw materials on a planet. So what I imagine in terms of equipment that is autonomous, that can operate on its own without waiting for guidelines from the sender, because guidelines take a very long time. Even the nearest star is 4 light years away. It takes like 4 years to travel the distance to the nearest star. So there is no way for a probe sent across the Milky Way galaxy to wait for instructions. It has to be autonomous. But artificial intelligence systems are autonomous after you train them. So just like kids, you can think of them as our technological kids that we will train through machine learning early on and then send to the world. And if we can imagine doing that, sending them to space, then perhaps a civilization that predated us, let's say by 1 billion years, could have done that already and filled out the Milky Way galaxy with such systems. It's quite possible because we know that most of the stars formed billions of years before the sun.
Thank you. 然后我们开始第2个问题。曾经16世纪呢，欧洲文艺复兴时期的意大利哲学家布鲁诺，因为他宣传哥白尼的日心说呢，而被判为了异端，最终被烧死。那么追求真理的道路是充满了曲折的。据我所知，主流科学家似乎对飞碟啊、外星人呐这个研究话题啊嗤之以鼻。许多主流科学家因为研究这个领域呢，而被贴上了伪科学的标签。那么在近年，由已故的登月宇航员埃德加·米切尔与瑞 荷兰德兹教授包括鲁迪希尔德博士，和您一样呢是哈佛大学天体物理学家。那么他们一起创立了一个叫 FREE 的地外接触研究基金会，旗下呢有30多个国际科学家都已经站出来一起去研究 UFO 现象、外星文明、意识科学、冥想濒死体验、超自然现象等学科。那么我想请问阿维教授，根据您在主流科学圈子这么多年的观察，主流科学界真的对这个领域非常排斥吗？甚至是禁止研究吗？还是说我们对此的认知是错误的？我想请您谈谈您的看法和观点，谢谢。
Yeah, so there is a lot of resistance in the mainstream of the scientific community to the study of equipment from other civilizations near Earth. And part of it is because the public is extremely excited about this subject, and there is a whole literature of science fiction and in which the laws of physics are violated and statements are made that are not standing up to the scientific level of credence. But there is a more fundamental problem with discussions on this subject, and that is when we discovered the laws of physics in the universe through laboratory experiments, we realized that all the physical objects in the universe surrender to the same laws and they obey them throughout the entire universe. And so we can feel superior relative to the physical world in two ways. One, that we can understand all the laws that control the evolution of the universe. So that gives a boost to our ego. And the second is that the physical world has no freedom, no choice, except for some uncertainty due to quantum mechanics that we can formulate in equations. But so we are superior because if there was an equation that would forecast the way we humans behave and we knew what it forecast, we could do something different and that would violate that equation. So we feel superior relative to the physical world in the sense that we are responsible for what happens to us. And in much the same way, we feel superior relative to low-level life. Such as, for example, bacteria or microbes. So if, for example, the Perseverance rover finds evidence for primitive life on the surface of Mars, we would still feel superior relative to it because we are intelligent and we are conscious. And the same is true relative to other animals here on Earth. We feel superior because our level of consciousness, our level of intelligence is higher than theirs. But if the Perseverance rover bumps into the wreckage of a spacecraft that we didn't send, that is far more advanced than any technology that we developed, that would be a blow to our ego. And that is fundamentally why it's being denied, why people are arguing that we might be the smartest kid on the cosmic block. There is nobody smarter than we are. And it resembles my daughters when they were very young and they stayed at home. They thought that they are the smartest in the universe, in the world. But when we took them to the kindergarten, they got a better perspective. So for our civilization to mature, it needs to find others. Now, there is another part, I should say, and that is that we don't know, for example, what most of the matter in the universe is. We call it dark matter. And for 4 decades, we invested hundreds of millions of dollars trying to find specific types of dark matter, some specific types of particles, and we didn't find them. And so, to me, now it's clear that we should do a similar search for equipment in space that was sent by other civilizations, because we now know from the Kepler satellite data that about half of all the sun-like stars that look like the sun, have a planet roughly the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. So if you arrange for similar circumstances in tens of billions of other planets, you might as well have the civilization that predated us. and send equipment into space that we can find. And it would make a lot of sense for us to search for it. And if we search for 4 decades, 40 years, and we invest hundreds of millions of dollars, and we don't find anything, then we will be at exactly the same point as the dark matter searches are now. So in my mind, it should be part of the mainstream, just like the search for dark matter is, the search for such equipment should be, because it has a bigger impact on humanity if we find something. If the dark matter is a specific type of particle, it will not change the lives of people. But if we find that an object like Oumuamua was artificial in origin, it could change the future of humanity. And so we have an obligation as scientists to put it in the mainstream of science. And in July, a few multi-billionaires came to the porch of my home and asked me questions about my book, Extraterrestrial. And as a result, they gave me about $2 million that allowed me to establish a new project called the Galileo Project. By now, we have more than 70 scientists within 2 months that joined the project. And what we are planning to do is search for objects like Oumuamua or like those unidentified aerial phenomena, these objects that appeared in the report to the US Congress, whose nature was not clear. That report was delivered on the 25th of June. So we have 2 goals within the Galileo project: to understand objects like Oumuamua or the unidentified aerial phenomena. In both cases, we are talking about objects whose nature is not known, that are near Earth. And I very much hope that in the coming months and years, the Galileo project will make a discovery. It's the first time that there is an assembly of scientists working together to build instruments using telescopes to look at the sky and figure out the nature of those unidentified aerial phenomena and objects like Oumuamua.
OK， 那么教授您提到了 UAP， 那么是在今年的6月25日，美国国防部呢发布了 UAP、UFO 的研究报告。虽然他们没有正面去承认这些飞行器呢就是外星人的飞船，但是呢从侧面又承认了这些飞行器的机动性和某些特性呢已经远远超出了地球目前已知的科技。那么对于这个报告，请问阿维教授，对此有什么样的看法呢？我们是否离外星人的正式接触越来越接近了呢？谢谢。
Well, the report came out from the government, which is a relatively conservative organization, but not from scientists. It included the incidents that military personnel witnessed, and the camera in a jittery cockpit of a fighter jet is not a scientific experiment. And that's where it became clear to me that this subject should move away from the talking points of politicians or military personnel into the realm of the mainstream of science, where scientists would use scientific instruments such as telescopes and infer the nature of these objects. So just to give you an example, an object the size of a person at a distance of 1 kilometer can be resolved with a megapixel image, an image that has 1 million pixels, using a telescope of size 1 meter, which in principle you can buy online these days for $500,000. You can add it to your bag. So this just illustrates that the cell phone cameras are not useful because they have an aperture that is only a few millimeters, and what you need is a telescope that is many orders of magnitude larger so that you will get a high resolution image. And if you get a megapixel image of a human-sized object, you can read off the label, whether it was made in a country on Earth or whether it was made on some exoplanet. You can see what it looks like. So it's not a philosophical question whether we are visited by objects that came from another place. So it's basically a question of getting a high resolution image and monitoring the motion of such objects with scientific instruments that we have full control over. So that's the key, to have full control, just like any other scientific experiment. That's what we are planning to do with the Galileo project. We are planning to buy instruments. We already started doing that, and then putting them together and tracking objects of interest. And if it looks like a bird, or if it looks like a drone, any human-made object will not be of interest to us. And birds would be of interest to zoologists, but not to me. What we would look for are unusual objects and try to get much more data so we can answer the question of whether they represent technologies beyond what we produce. And my point is, the evidence as of now that was released to the public is not conclusive. It's not convincing enough, but we can get good evidence if we invest scientific resources in that direction. And that's what the Galileo project aims to do. And we plan to use optical telescopes, infrared sensors, and radio detectors to try and monitor any objects of interest that are not natural in origin, not birds or phenomena in the atmosphere, and are also not human-made. So it's just like a fishing expedition where we go out and try to catch fish. And if they all end up being explained by some mundane explanations, if they all end up being sardines, so be it. But we will report, our data will be open, available to the public, and we'll follow the standard scientific procedure of analysis.
OK， 那么下一个问题，以色列太空安全项目负责人被誉为以色列卫星之父的海姆·埃希德教授，今年呢，他对媒体公开表示，人类一直在和来自银河联邦的外星人接触，并且呢，和美国政府也签署了合作协议。而特朗普不仅知道这一点，还差点泄露了这一消息。但是呢，外星人阻止了他的泄露，因为外星人认为人类还没有做好准备。我们当时看到这个新闻呢，非常的震惊，因为各国的主流媒体呢，都对此事有非常具体的报道。那么，请问阿维教授，您是否认识海姆·埃希德教授？您对此事有什么样的看法？我们非常希望知道更多的一些细节。谢谢。
Right. I don't know him personally. He actually approached me at some point, sent me an email. But I think it was irresponsible to report this story because anyone can say anything. And the key to whether a statement makes sense is whether there is evidence to support it. And the reporter should have asked for evidence because you know, if there are lots of people that would say that they are Napoleon, and you ask them for their ID card, and if it doesn't say Napoleon on the ID card, you don't pay attention to what they say. And so my point is that people can say a lot of things, but the only way for us to figure out if it's real is to look at the evidence. And unfortunately, he did not provide any evidence. As a scientist, I'm guided just by evidence. The reason I talk about Oumuamua is because the evidence was unusual. It didn't look like a comet or an asteroid. It looked like something else. And that made me suspicious that perhaps it's artificial in origin. And I'm completely guided by evidence, and I want to get more evidence before making a strong statement. So that's why I established the Galileo project, because science is guided by evidence. But just saying that humans were contacted, there is a federation, without providing evidence is irresponsible. And more irresponsible is to report about it. Now, I wanted to say that the subject as a whole could have a huge impact on the future of humanity if we find such evidence. And when I look at human history, I see that it's being shaped by the desire of groups of people to feel superior relative to other groups of people. The best example is the Second World War, where the Nazi Germany regime basically triggered the death of 75 million people, which was 3% of the world population in 1940. Just think about it. It's 20 times the number of deaths caused by COVID-19 that were triggered by a group of people who decided to feel superior relative to other people. And if we find evidence for a civilization far more advanced than we are, all of our small differences here on Earth would appear completely negligible. And my hope is that it will inspire us all to cooperate and treat each other with respect as members of the human species, equal members of the human species. And I very much hope that this would be one of the biggest influence on finding evidence for a technological civilization that is far more advanced than we are. But there are many other implications, and that's why we should explore this subject scientifically.
那么接下来的这个问题呢，其实我一直想问权威的天文学家或者天体物理学家，那就是关于 X 行星的 X Planet。今天呢，终于找到机会了。有一本书在我们 UFO 圈子里呢广为流传，叫做《地球编年史》。作者呢是一个考古学家，他的名字叫做萨加利亚·西琴。他主张外星人创造论，认为神话中的众神呢都是外星人，以及太阳系呢存在着一颗名为尼比如的椭圆轨道的行星，公转的周期是3600年，并且上面生活着叫做阿努纳奇，名为阿努纳奇的外星种族。西琴认为古苏美尔文明的众多考古证据呢可以支持这一观点，而在2012年的时候呢，有报道称美国航天局 NASA 宣布发现了 X 行星，但是随后呢又否认了这个说法。我想问阿维教授，您是否了解 X 行星尼比如的说法？您能对此谈谈您的看法吗？谢谢。
As far as I know, there was a search by a UV telescope, infrared telescope for planets near the sun, and there are very tight limits, especially by the WISE telescope, on even down to the scale of Jupiter-sized planets, but not much smaller than that mass. Within the solar system, definitely there is nothing that is the size of Jupiter all the way to the edge of the solar system, but there could be something smaller than that. Now, with respect to gods, I should say that, you know, when I teach at Harvard University, I usually tell my class that half of the students in the class are below the median of the class, and they get upset because they don't want to think that they have a 50% chance of being under the median. But that is a statistical fact, irrespective of how much their ego resists that. The median is defined such that half of the people are below it. And if I think about ourselves as a civilization, I wouldn't be surprised if we are sort of in the middle of the distribution of intelligent civilizations in the Milky Way galaxy. We are not the smartest. I would expect there to be smarter kids on our block. And that means that they do not communicate in the way that we do. They don't use the same means to propel themselves. And what we should be is open-minded about what we might see. It would look strange to us if we find evidence for things that they sent out. And when we read mythological stories about gods and so forth, it's possible that there was a visit in the past, although all the documented history that we have on Earth goes back at most to 10,000 years ago. We don't know what happened on Earth more than 10,000 years before that, and there is no documentation of that except, you know, just the global climate or geological conditions. But if there was a visit more than 10,000 years ago, nobody would have reported about it. And if it was 1 billion years ago, there would be only microbes on Earth. And so when people say, oh, we don't see anyone visiting, for example, Enrico Fermi raised the paradox, where is everybody? This is just like being at home and saying, nobody is knocking on my door right now, and therefore I don't have neighbors. Well, You just need to wait long enough. And the travel between stars takes a long time. With chemical rockets, it would take us 50,000 years to reach the nearest star. So 50,000 years is much longer than our recorded history. So it's possible that we had visits in the past and we didn't notice. And it's also possible that we should keep in mind that we will develop in our laboratories life. Already there are some laboratories getting close to making synthetic life in the laboratory. And perhaps at some point we will be able to create a universe in the laboratory if we understand quantum gravity. So all these attributes that we give to God of being able to create life, being able to create the universe, these kinds of things could be the outcome of a very advanced technological civilization. And if a very advanced civilization meets a much lower level civilization, it would look like an approximation to God.
OK， 那么教授，您对这个 X 行星是什么看法呢？就是您好像没有提到这个 X planet。
Well, I mentioned at the beginning that there is no evidence for another planet. There are people searching for a planet that is 5 times the mass of the Earth in the outer solar system. It's called Planet 9. We haven't found it. And there could be a planet that is 10 times or more the mass of the Earth in the outermost part of the solar system, but not closer than that. And, until we find evidence, we shouldn't really believe any of these stories. And as I said before, science is about evidence, and we should all follow the evidence and collect as much evidence as possible. So anyone that is excited about this possibility should become an astronomer and look for evidence using telescopes for either another planet in the solar system or for equipment that was sent by extraterrestrial civilizations, because once you find the evidence, then nobody would be able to argue with you. It will not be a philosophical question. It will be something that you can prove.
OK， 下一个问题，我看过一个纪录片，它的名字叫做《月球在苏醒》，里面呢揭示了月球上存在着大量的人造建筑废墟和一些无法解释的奇怪现象。然后呢，在全世界的范围内呢，许多人也认为月球上存在着外星文明的痕迹。我们呢也对此非常好奇，因为在这个纪录片里面也有很多讲到这个 NASA 可能拍到了月球上的很多的照片，但是它进行了涂抹然后这些照片呢就揭示了有一些人造建筑物在这个月球上。所以说，请问阿维教授，您对此有什么样的看法？这是否意味着我们并不孤单呢？谢谢。
Right. So the data that was collected in the US is not by NASA. It's collected by the military and the defense systems in the US. And the reason it's most of it is classified and not released is because the sensors that were used to collect this data are classified. And as a result, the public is not able to see the data. This is exactly the reason why we established the Galileo project, where we will have the data open because the sky is not classified. Astronomers look at the sky all the time. But if something flies above a telescope that astronomers are using right now, they will not track it. They will not try to understand the nature of an object that is very close to us. And the Galileo project will try to do that. We'll track the object and try to get as much data as possible. And in that sense, the mystery will go away and we will clear up the fog because currently the situation is not healthy. The scientific community ridicules the subject, even though the most conservative organization, the government, is talking about it. And at the same time, the public is left with uncertainty about the nature of these objects, left to speculate. And I think scientists have an obligation to attend to a subject that the public cares about. Because a good example is 1,000 years ago, there were people claiming that the human body has a soul and therefore anatomy should be forbidden. And just imagine if scientists would say, we don't want to discuss the human body because there is nonsense, it's controversial, there is nonsense being said about it. And they would ridicule the subject. Where would modern medicine be? So it's clear that when there is a question of great interest to the public, scientists should get engaged and clear it up using the scientific method. That's an obligation to the public, rather than the scientists staying in their academic community and dealing with questions that are not so interesting to the public, because the public funds science.
OK， 下一个问题，鲁迪希尔德博士和您一样的是哈佛大学天体物理学家，他是您的同事，他的思想非常开放，他支持外星生命起源说，也就是地球生命呢源自外星，同时他也在研究非常前沿的意识科学。您也是哈佛大学黑洞计划的创始人。那么史蒂夫·霍金以及加来道雄教授也经常讨论外星文明的话题。不知阿维教授，您是否与他们几位有过深度的交流？史蒂夫·霍金、加来道雄教授私下是否和您交流过这些话题呢？您可以谈谈吗？谢谢。
Yeah, definitely. Stephen Hawking actually, as I describe in my book, visited my home and he spent 3 weeks during April 2016, inaugurating the Black Hole Initiative and also the Breakthrough Starshot project that I lead. And I discuss it in my book. With Michio Kaku, I spent a couple of hours talking he had a podcast with me, and also we both participated in another podcast organized by someone else. And he basically shares the view that we should examine those unidentified objects the way I think about it. But in all these cases, Stephen Hawking or Michio Kaku, they never organized an experimental effort, a system of telescope that will go out and collect new data and evidence. And one of the things you learn from the experience of Galileo Galilei 4 centuries ago, there were philosophers arguing that they know the answer, that the sun moves around the earth, and they don't want to look through his telescope, and they put him in house arrest. But that only maintained their ignorance. The Earth continued to move around the sun. And today we use this fact for space missions. So we know it for sure. So the fact that these philosophers put Galileo in house arrest didn't matter. Today they would have canceled him on social media. But that's irrelevant. What mattered was the evidence which led Galileo to conclude by looking through his telescope that most likely the Earth moves around the sun. And the Galileo project is inspired by that. We want to find the answers by looking through new telescopes. And even though Stephen Hawking or Michio Kaku say the right things, that by itself is no proof. What we need is to look through telescopes and collect the data so that it will be beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not a philosophical question. It's a question of getting good images and monitoring the motion of these objects.
下一个问题，阿维教授，您的新书《天外来客：地球之外智慧生命的首个迹象》如果我没记错的话，最近呢在中国应该是正式出版了。我想请您介绍一下您的这本著作，并且呢，我们也会推荐给所有中国的 UFO 爱好者们去拜读谢谢。
Yeah, so the book was translated to 25 languages, and I had 1,200 interviews over the past 7 months about it. It became a bestseller in many countries, I hope also in China. And it describes the properties of Oumuamua, what made it unusual, unlike a comet or an asteroid, and why I think it may have been technological equipment. And in my mind, it opens a new window into the search for technological civilizations, because in the past, for 70 years, we've been searching for radio signals. And that is equivalent to trying to have a phone conversation. You need the counterpart to be active at the time that you're having the conversation. But a much better approach is to search for relics, equipment left behind, just like we sent Voyager or New Horizons spacecraft into space. Other civilizations may have done that in the past, and they predated us, and they might not be around anymore. Just like a lot of cultures on Earth are not around anymore, but we can use archaeology to find the relics that they left behind in archaeological digs. And in the same way, we can do archaeology in space, searching for debris or relics or equipment sent by civilizations that might not be around anymore. And that, I think, is a new frontier that was opened up by Oumuamua. And for more details, I invite the young people to read my book, because I believe that the next generation might actually find out the answer to this very important question: Are we the smartest kid on the block?
好的，那么我们最后两个问题，阿维教授，首先第一个问题，我们想展望一下未来。您以一个主流科学界的科学家，您认为在未来的5到10年，主流科学界会有什么样的走向和发展？我们人类呢，将会有什么样的未来呢？请您谈一谈，谢谢。
Yeah, I think that if we do engage in the search the way that the Galileo project does, and if additional funds are allocated, and I hope much more than $2 million that I have right now, I think we should invest at least tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. If we do that, I'm very optimistic that we might find something unusual out there. The worst that we can do is basically say business as usual, and we think that we have no mail in our mailbox. It's just like the solar system can be thought of as a mailbox, and if you don't walk to check whether your mailbox has mail, you might miss it. And that could be unfortunate, because maybe the mail that we have in our mailbox carries a very important message about the future of humanity that could lead to the salvation of humanity. And if we don't open the package, if we don't open the mail, we might miss that message. And so I am optimistic in my nature, and I hope that more scientists will join me, and eventually we'll open that mail and figure out what reality is like, what neighborhood we live in. You know, if we don't look through our windows and claim that we have no neighbors, that will not get rid of our neighbors. It will just maintain our ignorance, just like the philosophers that refused to look through Galileo's telescope. So I'm optimistic. I hope that more young people will join me in the scientific effort, and we will find evidence within my lifetime.
OK， 谢谢。最后的一个问题，阿维教授，我想请您呢做一个预测：如果外星文明真的存在，我们地球人类何时会和他们进行第一次接触呢？我们地球文明又何时会走入星际文明时代，真正的走向浩瀚的宇宙呢？我非常非常期待，真的非常希望有生之年可以看到这一重大时刻啊！所以想请您谈一谈，谢谢。
Yeah, so my hope is that my book and my scientific work will inspire the young generation of today to get engaged. And I think that together, within a decade or two, there is a good chance that we might find something. And of course, that will change the future of humanity. It will be the most important scientific discovery ever made throughout human history. And since it's so important, we should definitely do it rather than postpone it or not fund it, because the implications are so great. There is no bigger scientific question that we can address. And together with the young people of today that are not trapped by prejudice, I think we can make the important breakthrough that we all need to recognize that we don't live alone in this cosmic neighborhood.
OK， 那您觉得我们人类在有生之年可以和外星人面对面吗？并且有一个友好的接触吗？
Probably not. And my guess is we will meet equipment, perhaps artificial intelligence systems, and we will need to interpret their intent using our own artificial intelligence systems. So it will be just like consulting our kids when we see complicated content on the internet, because our kids are more computer savvy. And here I mean technological kids. The AI systems that we develop will be needed to understand their AI systems.
OK， 感谢尊敬的阿维洛普教授以及我们今天的翻译艾米，您是一个勇士，在面对如此大的主流科学界的学术压力之下呢，站出来揭示这些外星文明的证据，您在为真相而奋斗，所以我们中国的爱好者们也非常荣幸可以和您进行交流。我希望未来呢，您能够给中国的观众带来更多珍贵的信息。好的，我是塔哥，这次呢专访就到这里，感谢您，我们爱您，再见。
拜拜。
Thanks for hosting me, and I will definitely come back if I have interesting data. Thank you.
如果我有更多的数据的话，我也是会再来，就是这个节目。
好，谢谢。Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. I think we'll be like evening, right? So good
Thank you.
evening and bye bye.
Bye bye.